Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that on February 14th, 2026, Secretary of State Marco Rubio delivered a speech at the Munich Security Conference that fundamentally redefined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization from a military alliance into what he called a civilizational project designed to defend Western civilization against the threats of mass migration and cultural decline? And what if I told you that this speech represents not just a shift in American foreign policy rhetoric, but a systematic attempt to transform the foundational principles of international cooperation from shared security interests to shared racial and cultural identity? Rubio's address to European leaders marked a deliberate departure from decades of American diplomatic language that emphasized democratic values, rule of law, and shared security commitments as the basis for transatlantic partnership. Instead, the Secretary of State explicitly framed the relationship between the United States and Europe in civilizational terms, declaring that we are part of one civilization, Western civilization, and arguing that this shared heritage, rather than common political principles, should define the alliance moving forward. The speech came exactly 1 year after Vice President J.D. Vance delivered a scathing critique of European allies at the same venue, accusing them of cultural decline and overdependence on American support. Where Vance's remarks were received with shock and diplomatic embarrassment, Rubio's message was crafted to offer reassurance while delivering essentially the same ideological framework in more palatable language. The standing ovation from approximately half the audience masked the profound unease among many European leaders who recognized the implications of redefining their relationship with America in explicitly cultural rather than political terms. The centerpiece of Rubio's argument rested on what he described as the unique contributions of European civilization to world history. He cited Beethoven and the Beatles, the Sistine Chapel and the rule of law, universities and scientific method as distinctly Western achievements that required protection from what he characterized as existential threats. This framing deliberately conflates geographic, racial, and cultural categories in ways that exclude non-European NATO members and partners, while creating an implicit hierarchy of civilizational worth. The most revealing aspect of Rubio's presentation was his diagnosis of European decline, which he attributed not to external military threats or economic competition, but to internal cultural and policy failures. He attacked what he called climate cult policies that had supposedly weakened European industrial capacity, criticized mass migration as an urgent threat to the fabric of our societies, and argued that European leaders had embraced managed decline through deindustrialization and inadequate defense spending. This diagnosis serves a dual political purpose for the Trump administration. Domestically, it reinforces the cultural grievance narratives that animate the MAGA movement by projecting American concerns about immigration and cultural change onto the international stage. Internationally, it provides justification for American disengagement from traditional alliance obligations by arguing that European allies have betrayed the civilizational values that supposedly justify cooperation in the first place. The speech's treatment of migration reveals the explicitly racial undertones of the administration's foreign policy doctrine. Rubio's characterization of immigration as a threat to the survival of our culture echoes white nationalist rhetoric about demographic replacement and cultural erasure. His insistence that controlling who and how many people enter our countries is not an expression of xenophobia provides diplomatic cover for increasingly restrictive immigration policies while normalizing the language of cultural protectionism in international relations. European leaders' responses expose the profound dilemma created by Rubio's civilizational framing. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen praised the speech as very reassuring, while carefully avoiding any endorsement of its cultural nationalism. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot welcomed references to common legacy, while emphasizing European independence from American ideological frameworks. These diplomatic responses reflect European leaders' recognition that they face an impossible choice between accepting American cultural definitions of the alliance or risking the loss of American security guarantees. The strategic implications of redefining NATO as a civilizational alliance extend far beyond rhetoric into fundamental questions about the organization's membership, mission, and legitimacy. Turkey, a NATO member since 1952, finds itself implicitly excluded from Rubio's vision of Western civilization despite its crucial strategic location and military contributions. The civilizational framework creates theological and cultural tests for alliance membership that contradict NATO's founding principles of collective security based on shared democratic commitments. Rubio's complete omission of Russia from his speech revealed the administration's approach to great power competition through a civilizational rather than geopolitical lens. Traditional NATO strategy emphasized deterring Russian military aggression and defending democratic institutions from authoritarian subversion. The civilizational framework shifts focus from external security threats to internal cultural preservation. suggesting that the primary danger to Western societies comes not from hostile states, but from demographic and cultural change within allied nations themselves. The Secretary of State's decision to skip a scheduled meeting about Ukraine with European leaders underscored the administration's deprioritization of traditional security concerns in favor of cultural and civilizational themes. This absence sent a clear signal that American engagement with Europe would increasingly focus on shared cultural preservation rather than collective defense against external aggression. European leaders found themselves discussing Ukraine's defense needs without American participation, while listening to lectures about cultural decline and migration threats. The international reaction to Rubio's speech exposed the global implications of America's civilizational turn in foreign policy. Non-European countries at the Munich Security Conference expressed fury at what they perceived as a celebration of white European superiority disguised as diplomatic outreach. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's comment about seeking signs of respect from the United States took on new significance in the context of American rhetoric about civilizational superiority and cultural hierarchy. The domestic political calculus behind Rubio's message reflects the Trump administration's belief that foreign policy must serve the cultural grievances of its electoral base. By projecting American anxieties about demographic change and cultural transformation onto the international stage, the administration reinforces the narrative that American problems stem from global forces rather than domestic policy choices. The civilizational framework provides intellectual justification for isolationist impulses while maintaining the rhetorical commitment to alliance relationships. European defense officials privately expressed concern about the long-term implications of subordinating military cooperation to cultural conformity. NATO's effectiveness has historically depended on operational integration and shared strategic objectives rather than cultural homogeneity. The civilizational framework threatens to undermine military cooperation by introducing ideological tests that have no bearing on battlefield effectiveness or strategic coordination. The economic implications of Rubio's civilizational doctrine create additional complications for transatlantic cooperation. His attacks on European climate cult policies and green energy investments directly contradict European Union's strategic priorities for economic development and energy independence. The administration's characterization of environmental policies as cultural decline rather than economic strategy creates barriers to cooperation on issues ranging from technology development to trade relations. The timing of Rubio's speech, delivered on Valentine's Day, was intended to symbolize a renewed romantic attachment between America and Europe. However, the content suggested a relationship based on cultural dominance rather than mutual respect. European leaders found themselves in the position of receiving declarations of love that came with explicit demands for cultural conformity and implicit threats of abandonment for noncompliance. The Trump administration's civilizational foreign policy represents a fundamental departure from the post-war international system based on institutional cooperation and shared democratic values. By substituting cultural identity for political principles as the basis for alliance relationships, the administration undermines the universalist aspirations that have defined American global leadership since World War II. The civilizational framework creates an explicitly hierarchical international system based on cultural and racial categories rather than political commitments. The broader implications of this shift extend beyond NATO to all aspects of American international engagement. If alliance relationships depend on cultural conformity rather than shared interests or values, then American cooperation becomes contingent on partners' willingness to accept American cultural definitions of legitimate governance and social organization. This approach transforms diplomacy from negotiation between sovereign equals into instruction from cultural superiors to cultural subordinates. European public's responses to Rubio's message revealed the gap between elite diplomatic reception and popular understanding of the civilizational framework. While European leaders offered polite diplomatic responses, public opinion polling showed significant concern about American attempts to impose cultural definitions on European societies. The civilizational rhetoric resonated more strongly with European far-right movements than with mainstream political parties, suggesting potential for American policy to strengthen extremist forces within allied countries. The constitutional implications of the civilizational approach raise questions about the relationship between American democratic principles and foreign policy practice. The Constitution makes no reference to civilizational superiority or cultural hierarchy as legitimate basis for international relations. Executive branch officials' embrace of explicitly racial and cultural frameworks for foreign policy represents a departure from constitutional principles of equality and democratic governance. Friends, what we witnessed in Munich was not merely a diplomatic speech, but the articulation of a new American approach to international relations based on cultural dominance rather than democratic partnership. Rubio's civilizational framework transforms alliance relationships from cooperation between sovereign equals into cultural instruction from superior to subordinate civilizations. The European response revealed the impossible choice facing American allies: accept cultural subordination in exchange for security guarantees, or assert cultural independence at the risk of American abandonment. This dilemma reflects the broader transformation of American foreign policy from promoting universal democratic values to defending particular cultural identities against demographic and social change. The Munich speech exposed the racial and cultural anxieties underlying current American foreign policy while providing diplomatic language to normalize white nationalist themes in international relations. By characterizing immigration as civilizational threat and cultural preservation as strategic necessity, the administration legitimizes exclusionary policies through appeals to shared Western heritage. The long-term consequences of this approach will determine whether the transatlantic alliance survives as a partnership of democratic equals or transforms into a cultural protection racket, serving the demographic anxieties of white populations in America and Europe. European leaders must now decide whether their relationship with America depends on accepting civilizational definitions that contradict their own democratic values in multicultural societies. The choice facing the international community is whether to accept American leadership based on cultural hierarchy or to develop alternative frameworks for cooperation based on democratic equality and mutual respect. Rubio's Munich speech clarified that the Trump administration views international relations through the lens of civilizational competition rather than democratic cooperation, forcing allies to choose between American protection and their own political principles.